But so I was going to university in Dallas, and when I was 19, I was going to this evangelical church in Dallas. And at the time, the senior pastor, his father was British, and he lived in England, was a vicar. And so this church had kind of this relationship with the UK, and they were kind of big on international missions. And so they had this idea, hey, we sort of have all these sort of stories swirling around in the culture about secularization and the decline of the church. And we know that we don't necessarily feel it in the same way in Dallas, but we know this is a thing that's theoretically happening. What if we put together a team, like a short-term missions team, and sent them over to the UK, not for the purpose of trying to convert people, but just to learn about what has happened to the church in this, quote, secular context in the UK, and what learnings can they pull from the UK that they can bring back to Texas so that we can do ministry more effective in Dallas. So I was selected to be part of this short-term team that went over. So I had this experience of going to the UK when I was 19, and kind of getting to connect with these different sorts of ministries that were sort of combining kind of community, what I would call now estuary. So kind of creating spaces for deconstruction or exploration, and then also pairing that with social entrepreneurship. So kind of a real focus on like starting enterprises rather than just trying to pull people into church. So I found that to be a really fascinating space to be in. And one of those that was a startup incubator offered me a job as a designer, which is what led me to move over when I was 20. So I kind of got to do some of the ministry and community stuff, and then also do more of the arts and design work for a year. So, and what was really fascinating about that is that they sent over, it was a fairly diverse team of people to the UK. I mean, when I say they, I'm talking about this evangelical church that I was going to in Texas. They sent over this team, and we spent about 2 weeks in London. And when the team came back, the result was most of the team members de-churched.
Oh, I just lost you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yep, I hear you now. So you got right to the punchline. When we came back, most of the church. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, my AirPods. Yeah. So when our team came back, over a period of a year or two, most of the people on the team de-churched and deconstructed as a result of being sent over to see how ministry was being done in the UK. So just thinking through, how can we challenge these paradigms? Does the megachurch thing, does that make sense? And so the church ended, I don't think the church actually learned much from the experience. I got loads out of it. I mean, it changed my life basically. You know, so that really had a huge influence on me. And then coming over to the UK at that time to work, and then also think through kind of the missiological side of what we were doing, totally changed kind of the trajectory of my life and just the way that I thought about so many different things, especially coming from like the Midwest and Texas, you know, very, very different experience. I'd like to tell you that was a good experience. I learned a lot for sure.
Not all learning experiences are pleasant.
No. I didn't, well, I guess the way that I kind of look back on that in retrospect is that my time working as a missionary in Asia, that was the start of, I had already discovered like Peterson and was listening to a little bit of you. I probably discovered Pajot a little bit later on, but I already kind of had a lot of these wheels turning in the back of my head. And I kind of look back on my experience in Korea as the start of a certain type of deconstruction that I think that I have still been working through.
Yep.
So when I moved to Korea, I didn't really have a background in kind of the Pentecostal world. I didn't really know much about kind of either the theology or just the style of ministry, just the general cultural approach that I was jumping into. And so it was, I mean, it was really interesting, just learning how to do kind of teaching or fellowship in group contexts with Koreans in English, because the cultural norms are completely different. And a lot of the ministry paradigms that I found were much more focused around how can we grow the numbers of the parachurch ministry, rather than what would, effective mission learning and discipleship necessarily look like in this cultural context, especially being in Seoul, which is a fairly kind of metropolitan, cosmopolitan area of Korea. And I found the missiological context of South Korea, I found to be just really fascinating, because in a way they're kind of the only Eastern Asian nation that has some kind of rich Christian heritage to them. They're not like, I mean, obviously there are a lot of Christians in China. That's a very different context though.
Right.
Japan is going to be very different from South Korea.
Right.
And, I thought, wow, this is, so if you go to South Korea, it's thought of as being this very Christian nation. But there's been a huge generational collapse in South Korea.
Really?
Oh yeah, if you poll the younger generations, it's as secular as London. No, I think, it especially going to South Korea, coming from Texas, both nations have a mega church culture.
Yes.
The largest church in the world is in Seoul.
Yes.
And so, I found that dynamic to be very interesting, because in some ways, Korea has had a large American presence for many decades because of the military. And so there's a sense in which they try to emulate a lot of American models.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder to what extent the kind of megachurch phenomenon is part of that emulation. One of the things we found, just in terms of the parachurch ministry, was the ways that Korean students would often prefer to be, say, studying the Bible in English rather than Korean, because in the Korean language, hierarchy is built into the language. So one of the things you do in Korean culture is you always want to know the age of everyone in the room.
Right. Yep.
Because the oldest person, you're addressed differently.
Yep.
And so if I have, say, a question about faith or anything in that realm, me speaking to you where you're the older person,
yep.
There's a level of sometimes formality or hierarchy that people will say, I find this to be very stifling. I feel more free to ask questions in English, for instance, than ask, my elders in Korea. Obviously, I'm again speaking in very broad strokes here, but I saw this very frequently in some of the churches that I was in there. I think one of the interesting splits you see is the difference between what I'll call kind of the broadly Presbyterian world in Korea, and then with the broadly charismatic world. And culturally, you can almost see a parallel between those two spaces and the history between Confucianism and shamanism in Korean culture historically. Yeah, so you really see a lot of the same patterns.
Let me guess, the Presbyterians and the Confucians are lined up, and the shamans and the Pentecostals are lined up.
Right.
And the story that you told of, churches don't send a group like that to study, what happens, why, the death of church in London. We're going to send a group of missionaries, short-term missionaries, to study this. And, they're sort of like Joshua's spies who go out into the land. Right. I mean, it's not the kind of people they'd sometimes send on mission trips to the Dominican Republic. When I get letters from pastors saying, yeah, I'm sending you these people, things aren't really going very well in their life, and we're hoping this mission trip will kind of shake them out of things. I'm like, well, great, you're sending me your problems. No, these are people in the church that the church has a degree of confidence in, that seem to be sort of stable and centered. And to have that many come back after 2 weeks and start to deconstruct is that's a phenomenal data set. And you've somehow managed to, go all over the place, and this hasn't sort of blown a certain piece of you apart that would look at the church and say, no more Christianity. I'm going to go out there and, make stuff up as I go along. You're continuing, regardless of, where you're at right now in terms of, well, what do I see? You're still in the game. You haven't walked away from the game. So that's why I found, what you've sort of laid out today very, very interesting. That probably didn't help you at all, but it's sort of me processing the conversation so far.
I did that idea that we've got this data set where I had this experience of going from Texas megachurch to postmodern ministry, across the pond in Europe. We come back and lots of people deconstruct or de-church and think, okay, well, as I'm moving from experience to experience, what is kind of keeping me grounded? Or for me, how have I stayed engaged with my faith or the church?
Yeah.
A lot of it is through those issues of how do I make life livable? How do I make life manageable? And that is so built into models around recovery, anything in 12 steps. It's all about your life has become unmanageable. And I think, are we making people's lives unmanageable when we reduce God purely to the transcendent?
Yeah.
And what are the implications of this for, well, all sorts of things, I guess.
Yeah.
How does this help me live the story? How am I able to embody this? I've really been, I've been to an Orthodox church a couple of times here in London, like very recently, just because I've listened to so much Pajot. I'm like, I might as well see what this is about.
Absolutely.
And I actually had, the first time I lived in London, I had a roommate who grew up Greek Orthodox and was doing missions, had gone to seminary, and he had deconstructed his way out of Orthodoxy and is now in a kind of, he went the opposite direction. He's now in like an Anabaptist type, like as far as the opposite as you can go. And so, I know you've been talking a little bit recently about, there's all this energy around. People are so interested in orthodoxy and they're moving into this space, and especially in North America, there's more of that energy in that space. And I'm like, a lot of that really appeals to me and speaks to me. Like I've listened to enough Pajot where I can buy into a lot of it. But at the same time, I also know, but I know people that have deconstructed their way out of that to something that's on the opposite end. So it's this kind of a little mental check that I have against, I don't know. I have been somewhat cautious in moving too strongly in any direction over the past few years, I guess, simply because I'm just so gripped by that question of like, what is actually going to be livable? I actually, when I was finishing up university and was deciding what did I want to do next, like, was I going to go to do the missions thing in Korea? I actually considered just going to seminary. And I was like, I'll do a PhD in missiology or something like that. So I remember I toured a couple different seminaries. And one of the ones I went to was Gordon Conwell, because that's where my father went. I remember talking to this third-year seminarian, and he said, I just can't wait to be done with seminary because I haven't had a non-believing friend in like 3 years. And I remember thinking to myself, why are you in seminary? Like you've actually dug yourself into a hole where not only are you're not in like an estuary-like space where people are actually struggling through, grappling with these very real and present things. But now you've just learned all this jargon. Now now you're a theologian. Now you're in an even worse position to speak to people in a way that they're going to understand. So I looked at that on one hand, and then I looked at some other seminaries that were a little bit more on kind of the progressive side. And I went to tour Duke Divinity School. And
Oh.
the first day that I showed up to the first day I showed up to Duke Divinity School was the day that Trump was elected. It was election day. Yeah. So I got in, was like watched the election, and by the morning when I showed up on campus, that was when Hillary had conceded. Yeah. So I mean, you can imagine what that experience was like.
Was it sackcloth and ashes and
oh yeah, I mean,
the end is near?
I remember I went in to tour some kind of survey of the old, or I was like sampling, I was sitting in on a couple of classes, and one of them was like survey of the Old Testament. And I mean, whoever was the lecturer, you would have thought her dog had died or something. Like, she just looked terrible, and it was the whole thing. I remember I was sitting in this lecture, and there was someone sitting next to me, and she goes, "Wow, I mean, you must be so upset because you're not even taking notes." And yeah, anyway, so I was in that environment. I thought, okay, going to seminary is clearly not for me.
Yeah.
I want to be out in a much more embodied sense. I want to be in that estuary like space.
Yeah.
Because that's where I find, that's that thing that I think Peterson touches on so much, which is, Israel is he who wrestles with God.
Yeah.
And I want to be in a space where people are wrestling the real things that are really in front of them.
It's so often the case that it is the weaknesses that, in sort of a second Corinthians 12 moment, it is the thorn in the flesh. It is the weaknesses which, many people just come to Christ and say, well, would it harm your plan for the world if I weren't just so darn susceptible to X?
Right.
And Christ says, no, my grace is sufficient for you. I'm going to leave that thorn just where it is. And that thorn is what you are going to wrestle with. And because in that wrestling, I love this quote from C.S. Lewis, where he talks about the fact that God gives so many gifts, he just gives so many gifts out into the world, just a profligate in terms of, you can find bliss, you can find escape, you can find excitement, you can find all these things out in the world. What you can't find is security. And so it's that sin that Christ won't simply exercise from us. Though sometimes I've seen, I've known people who bang, they had a bad situation with alcohol, and bang, they were done. And it's like, okay. I've known people with porn with the same thing. I've known many others who have struggled with it at various different levels. For many people, it doesn't necessarily rise to the height of addiction, in that they just destroy their life to the degree that the people living outside my office have. But how it is, in fact, in this space of recovery that, well, I need to go to my group, or I need to go to my church, or I need, it's at that moment of great need where this tension we have with Christ, this wrestling with God that Peterson, points to in Jacob at the Jabbok River. It's in this place that, well, maybe others get the luxury of deconstructing, but if I deconstruct, no, none of us want that.